A band of adventurers proceeds cautiously down a dark stone corridor. Just the day before, one of their party was killed in a pitched battle with the green-nosed tribe of goblins. As they reached the site of their earlier battle, the adventurers noticed that the body of their late companion and the slain goblins were all missing. The floor of the dungeon was unusually clear of blood and debris. "Strange," the rogue remarked. "Goblins are usually so filthy." The party continued through a T intersection before they saw a skeleton floating through the air towards them. The barbarian charged, sword raised high, but instead of attacking a skeleton, she was engulfed into a giant mass of gelatinous ooze. The rogue, seeking cover, turned around and ran straight into another transparent ooze. The party was surrounded, and it would take all of their wits just to survive. Hello, my name is Andrew, and today I'm talking about dungeons and low-level play. What are dungeons for? It's called Dungeons & Dragons. Clearly, they are important. Beyond providing a challenge for characters, I think that there are two major reasons to use dungeons in your game. The first is loot. In older editions of D&D, gold equaled experience points. For every 1 gold you recovered from a dungeon, you got 1 point of experience. You didn't need to do anything with that gold, you just needed to get it out of the dungeon. This evokes a very old-school sword and sorcery style of play, where the characters are primarily motivated out of a sense of greed. Now that kind of style of play can be done in 5e, but it's going to require a little bit of work from the DM to rebalance things. The major issue is that it takes a lot of experience points to get from level to level. For example, it takes 1,800 experience points to get from 3rd to 4th level, meaning you need 1,800 gold pieces. That's a lot. So I would probably half it and say that you only need 900. Another kind of cool loot that you can find in dungeons are magic items. It's sort of assumed that by about 5th level that you'll have a +1 sword, and so dungeons can be a great way to award those items. Having a loot-oriented game can be great for a beer and pretzel style game, which is to say a casual game. Some people just want to get together, roll math rocks, kill orcs, get loot, and level up. And here's the thing, that's perfectly fine. And I've known many players throughout the years that just wanted to show up and hang out. The other thing that I really like about dungeons are that they build a sense of history. Somebody built these dungeons. Who? When? Why? Finding the answers to those questions can help the DM to build out the history of their world. One thing that's implied about dungeons is that they are made from a previous, more advanced civilization. D&D is generally assumed to be set in a medieval Europe analog. And so the historical example is the fall of the Roman Empire. In the real world, the medieval period began just a couple hundred years after what was considered to be at the time something of an apocalypse, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. A great example from fiction is Adventure Time. It is set explicitly in a post-apocalyptic world. It takes place in a slightly alternate version of our world, but following nuclear Armageddon. All of the cool magic items that we're finding in dungeons are assumed to be from an older, more technologically or magically advanced past. Now let's loop back around to challenging the characters. My sort of mantra for this is that the bad guys want to win. They don't know that they're the villains. And so I like to have them act intelligently. They're willing to take prisoners, and they're willing to ransom characters. They're also willing to negotiate. One of my favorite bands of creatures to use are goblins. My favorite thing to do is to have goblins set spike traps in the middle of the battlefield. The goblins know where they need to avoid, but the characters don't. So what happens in the battle with the goblins is the goblins will charge into melee. They'll disengage because the goblins are very good at breaking and running. The melee characters will charge after and will inadvertently fall down into a spike trap. Here we have the goblin stat block, and we see that they have nimble escape. This allows them to either disengage or hide as a bonus action on each of their turns. This means that our melee goblins, using their scimitars, are going to be able to move into melee, attack with their scimitar, and then move away without provoking attacks of opportunity. Our ranged goblins, meanwhile, are going to be able to use their short bows and hide as a bonus action, which will give them advantage on their next attack. Goblins are, to my mind, chaotic. So in combat, they're constantly breaking and running. They're skirmishers. My advice as a DM is that if you're going to try to put those spike traps in your combats, don't make them too nasty and give the characters a decent chance to avoid or notice them. I think a DC 12 perception or dexterity saving throw is appropriate, and I would keep the damage to 1 or 2d6. Another band of creatures that I really like to use are orcs. Orcs are very intimidating. Even though they're only about twice as tough as a goblin, the players are going to be a lot more intimidated when a bunch of orcs show up. Orcs are aggressive, so they are constantly charging into battle. Here we have our orc stat block. We can see that they have aggressive, which allows them to, as a bonus action, move up to their speed towards a hostile creature they can see. This means that they are quite mobile and can charge straight into combat. I think that orcs are also classically chaotic creatures, but this manifests differently than with the goblins. With the goblins, they're constantly breaking and running. They're a bunch of skirmishers. With the orcs, however, they value strength. and so only the strongest orc gets to be chief. Like goblins, I think orcs generally have a tribal structure. One of my favorite tricks to use with them is when the players are walking down a long, wide corridor, describe how the walls are all freshly plastered. The players are generally a little confused by this. A little while later, when a bunch of orcs jump through the walls and surround the party, it's a great surprise. The third type of creature that I like to bring up are kobolds. Kobolds are very unlike orcs and goblins. Kobolds are lawful, which is to say that they act in a much more organized manner. And so even though they're weaker than goblins, they tend to stick together and fight in formation, thanks to their pack tactics. Here we have our kobold stat block. We see that they have pack tactics. This means that whenever they have an ally within 5 feet of an enemy creature, all of the kobolds have advantage on attack rolls against that creature. One consequence of using kobolds is that you're going to end up needing to use a lot of kobolds, because they're pretty weak on their own. But when there's a whole bunch of them, they can be pretty deadly as well. Remember those gelatinous cubes from earlier? They're perfect fodder for a low-level party. I think they're also a very interesting kind of monster. There aren't really oozes in a lot of things, like there's no oozes in Skyrim. Oozes and slimes are very strange, and they don't really fit into any kind of game other than a dungeon. A gelatinous cube is a transparent cube that goes around the dungeon and keeps things clean. They're basically the vacuums. They do acid damage, and they slowly dissolve anything unfortunate enough to be caught inside of them. Here we have our gelatinous cube stat block. They've got quite a few features, but the important ones are transparent and engulf. Transparent means that if they are standing still, it's quite difficult to see them because they are transparent. Engulf, meanwhile, means that creatures that are forced into the cube get sucked in and start taking a ton of acid damage. They can't dissolve, however, inorganic material, meaning that bones from earlier or armor or weapons are going to be left behind. Mimics are another kind of monster that I think really only fit inside of dungeons. They are dedicated trap monsters. You open up a chest, and a tongue lashes out as it tries to eat you. Here we have our mimic stat block, and we can see that their important feature is false appearance. This means that whenever they are standing still, they appear to be a mundane object. Quite often a chest, but also could be a wardrobe or a table, if you like. My piece of advice whenever you're trying to use traps or use a sneak attacking monster like the orcs or the goblins is to set it up. Give the players a hint that it's going to happen, but don't make it obvious. The intention when you're doing this is not necessarily to give it away, but to make it so that when the traps do finally spring, the players think, oh my god, if only we had been more clever, we would have avoided the trap. Once you spring one of those traps on the players, they're going to start to be a lot more cautious. And they're going to get in the right mindset to be clearing through dungeons. Overall, outside whether you plan on using dungeons merely as part of a larger campaign, or whether you want to run a dedicated dungeon crawl, that using dungeons can be a great way to dispense loot, that they can be a great way to build history, and that they can be a very interesting place to have encounters. All that said, thank you guys for watching. Peace out.